So in terms of ground rules, we only really have one, which is about respect. So please respect each other. Please respect the different views, which we expect to hear. Please respect each other's time, which includes trying to be quick, as I said to Claire, convey what you need to convey, but no more. And also, I will try to make sure that we leave or are able to leave at 8:30, which means there may be moments when I ask you to stop speaking or to finish your point. Please don't be offended by that. That's me trying to respect everyone's time. On our agenda, basically the flow of our evening, we are doing the setup and the framing now. In a moment, Alex will put you into groups of 3 so you can have some bridging introductions. It's a bit too many people for everyone to introduce themselves, but with the bridging, you'll have a chance to know at least some of the other people in the room. Then we'll come back and John will give us his view on our question. And our question this evening is what's the bigger plan for democratic innovation? How do we make attempts on national style assemblies unignorable, that kind of thing? So John will give us 5 minutes on that. And then we'll invite you to share your stories, your experiences. What are the things and insights that come out of your stories? And we'll hopefully have a chance for everybody to share a story who's got one. At about 8:10, we'll then move into drawing together the meaning we're making. We'll start with Claire giving her sense of the themes that she's heard so far, and people will have a chance to add, to disagree, to build on all of those things in order for us to end at 8:30. Often Josh will have at that point an amazing picture which shows what we've been talking about. We'll see, hopefully we'll have a chance to have that again. And we may even have a chance for Jen to sing at us in some Lancastrian dialect, which means we won't understand it, but we will feel it very deeply. So that we may have that chance as well. And that also speaks to the thing which Claire has mentioned. We have a couple of people who are unlikely to say anything unless they're very, very moved, but they come from the creative side of hard art. And they are trying to bring this different way of expressing what they're experiencing, more than just a dusty report, maybe a poem, maybe an illustration, maybe a song, maybe a novel, maybe a TV show, who knows? But that's what those people are there for. So without further ado, Alex, could you split us into groups? Or rather, sorry, before you do that, I should tell you what you're going to do in your groups. Otherwise, you'll just sort of be sitting there going, what the hell have we been told to do? So we're going to be split into groups with 3 people. And our question for you is just to introduce yourself and say what brought you here this evening. So what your sort of the blind date kind of question. What's your name? Where do you come from? And what has brought you here this evening? We're going to give you 4 minutes for the 3 of you. So we're going to be incentivizing you to provide that concision that will be so important through the rest of our evening. So now that I've given the instruction, Alex, we can split people off and hopefully you'll meet at least one other new person. See you back here in 4 minutes. Cool. And we're back. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm sure if it's anything like our previous roundtables in our own group, you would have been keen for more time. Yes. But we promised that we'll be ending our session by 8:30, and therefore we need to get into the meat of it now. And that means that I hand over to John and invite John just to frame this question for us as the question holder about what's the bigger plan in democratic innovation? How do we make outputs from any national style assembly unignorable? What are your thoughts on that, John?
So I guess, I mean, I think I'd frame like this idea of making things unignorable is I guess a bit of a reaction to the idea that the question is how do you communicate the outputs better, or how do you follow on from an assembly? And I think increasingly, and actually even in the last few days, I've been coming more to a place of like, we need to flip the question actually on its head and think more about how can assemblies and participatory democracy exercises and be really valuable actually in seizing cultural moments, rather than starting with the question, we've got an assembly and how do we create a cultural moment off the back of it. And so what I want to do is just give you 3. I've been thinking and researching a lot, like examples from around the world of when genuine democratic change actually happens. Because I think we're in the game now where there's no point talking about small stuff. Like it's like, when does really big shift happen? And so I was going to talk about three things and then just quickly allude to what we were trying to do with a project that Sarah Castell and I were both involved in off the back of that. So the three examples, firstly, Ireland, and I'll do this quickly, but David, like, skip me along. I'm going to go to Ireland, not to the abortion, to the assembly on abortion that then was followed up by the referendum. That's kind of a story that I suspect everyone in this room knows, or if not, you can find it more easily elsewhere. But how the mechanism that exists in Ireland for there to be citizens' assemblies on constitutional questions that are then followed by a referendum, how that mechanism ever came to be. And the story actually, and the point that I'm trying to make through all these three stories is like seizing moments of cultural significance, or what I would call kind of potential political energy, and translating them into something genuinely meaningful through like a major participatory democracy exercise is my hypothesis for how this happens. So in Ireland, the very first citizens' assembly in Ireland, or like in the current context, happened during the financial crisis, when basically Ireland was in all sorts of trouble. Trust in politics was below 10%. It's somewhere around 20% in the UK right now, to give you a benchmark. Or was, but even before the election, it's actually slightly higher now. So that just gives you a sense of how low it was. And what happened was a group of academics actually organised themselves and created a one-off assembly and a wider sort of consultation around the questions like, how do you rebuild trust in politics, and how do you respond to the strictures of the IMF? And long story short, like, partly because of the moment in time, it got a degree of attention, and partly because of the way that they did it, by inviting politicians from all the major parties to present as witnesses, not to control the process, nor to be sort of members of the assembly. They were able to create a kind of space that politics could move into. They demonstrated something at a moment of like complete loss and wide public awareness, that then set the tone. So it was off the back of that the Irish Constitutional Convention was created, and off the back of that the current mechanic that then was used in the abortion referendum was developed. So I'm really interested in, like, how do you create things from outside of the existing systems rather than how do you get the existing system to commission them? I think that's the spirit of this conversation. So that's one example. Like responding to that moment really quickly and energetically, and capturing it. The second example is Taiwan, and lots of people have heard me talk about this before, but I think the story there is that they were building for a long time these sort of parallel state systems with URLs ending G0v.tw, calling themselves Gov0. And then when a protest moment came, when the government tried to rush through a trade bill with mainland China and they occupied the parliament, the Gov0 gang got a broadband connection in, streamed footage of what the protesters were doing inside the parliament all over the country. And what they were doing was using Gov0 tools to discuss the clause of the trade bill. And that created, like, that's harnessed that moment, created a moment of unignorable potential shift that then the Speaker of the Parliament had to step into. And that was the moment that unlocked an awful lot of what then followed in Taiwan. Up until that point, Audrey Tang, which the name some of you will know, was just a hacker, just a member of the Gov0 movement, and ended up becoming a minister, now Taiwan's sort of cyber ambassador, all that sort of stuff. And then the third example is from Canada, where in the context of the of the likelihood of Quebec seceding in the 1990s, a news magazine called Maclean's got 12 Canadians in a house for a week in a kind of Big Brother style context, and with a team from the Harvard negotiation, I can't remember, Harvard negotiation unit or something, and they spent in-depth time with them, interviewing them every day, making a documentary about it. And then off the back of that, deliberately followed their journeys, followed the fact that their conversations went way deeper than Quebec or not, and into what do we want Canada to be, and then created the materials that allowed conversations to seed all around the country. And that is credited, as far as I understand it, with shifting the kind of national conversation. All of which is to say, as I come to the end of 5 allowed minutes, and I hope this has made some sense, my brain's a little bit all over the place, and hopefully you saw that 8-minute thing that Claire and I recorded as well. But all of which is to say, I'm kind of, the question I'm holding at the moment is almost more like, how might we in advance kind of identify what might be a crisis point, or how do we build up to a kind of crisis point and then be ready to translate it with an assembly, rather than asking the question, how do we make assemblies have impact? So I will kind of, I think, stop there.
Great. Thank you, John. So we have a variety of questions for people to speak to and to bring stories against. The starting ones from the invite about what's the bigger plan to democratic innovation? How do we make the outputs of any national style assembly unignorable? And then the one that John ended with there, how might we identify in advance and act on crises as they're happening, rather, and to use that as moments for making a big difference.
Or sorry, just to qualify, or predict, or sort of notice moments that are coming. And the thing that Sarah, I'm sure, will be able to speak to as well and better than me, is what we tried to do off the back of David Attenborough's Wild Owls documentary series with the People's Plan for Nature, intending to kind of grab that moment.
Yeah, grabbing moments that we can see might be coming up and designing in advance the participatory processes which will use those. So with that, it's time to turn over to you and see who has a story against those questions that they'd like to share. I would love to be able to volunteer a woman first. There's lots of evidence that if the first person to speak is a woman, then it opens up the space a bit better for everybody. So that's an open invitation for any of the non-males, I'm not sure how to put this, to stick their hand up and tell us a story. Kathy, is it Kathy or Katie?
Oh, it's Kathy.
Kathy.
It's Kathy. So yeah, okay. I think it's all well and good grabbing a moment, but really what is important is the effect that moment has. And for me, I'm thinking about the outputs. For those to be unignorable, I think the whole process has to be unignorable from the beginning all the way through to the end and onwards. And one essential ingredient that's been missing, and that includes from the People's Plan for Nature and loads of other things, is comms, comms, and more comms. And it's absolutely essential for, if you want a citizen assembly or any assembly to be seen as legitimate, people need to understand what it is, and they need to know that one's taking place. So I heard somebody talking about a film, and I've always wanted, I've always been trying to sort of get the storyline of a citizens assembly to be in a soap, but I haven't managed to sort of get anybody to take that up. But I would say that I just want to use an example, the Swedish Climate Assembly that happened quite recently, that had a really comprehensive strategy to get continuous interest from the media and from the public. So even before the assembly started, they got key national key media involved by writing a really good press release, contacting key journalists, explaining the importance and the potential. From the beginning, two well-known celebrities mentored the assembly and helped create an interest. Then national TV coverage. There was a journalist who they gave exclusivity. I hate that word, but there we go. And they opted for that because they wanted to avoid the process being too disturbed or interrupted. And of course, they couldn't listen into or record group deliberations. There were video journals with members. There was in-depth engagement from the Swedish media because it was being messaged as something positive, overriding polarization, how people can come together and creating a climate for positive news. And they really felt that assembly members as a spokesperson is really powerful, communicators of their own experience. They encouraged members to reach out to local newspapers, By promoting the members means also being ready for anything, letting go. So if they had a criticism should be welcomed, embraced, because that's about being authentic. Posters in bus stops, on hoardings. They had a social media strategy, expert lectures on YouTube, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook. They had to choose some, and some they left off. They think they could have had more researchers to encourage dialogue on social media because you need to be responsive. Using accessible language. I've nearly finished. I might have gone over 2 minutes. Unignorable. Unignorable, and I would say that I would like to add, and don't let's overlook the role civil disobedience can play, as exemplified by the response to the introduction of the 1919 poll tax. So if they're ignored, you've got to have people on side, and then hopefully they will push for any recommendations to be acted upon.
Great. Thanks so much, Kathy. It's very interesting to be having this conversation. What is it now? 23 hours since the South Korean president declared martial law, and then a certain amount of protesting and disobedience and of parliamentary response, and martial law was rescinded. I actually have, within 4 or 5 hours, I have a friend who's having a holiday in South Korea. She slept through the entire thing. That's how quickly it was all over. Thank you very much, Kathy, and thank you for the story about the Swedish example too, where there were many, many different little practices there, which sound really, really important. And the key thing I take from what you said there was about making the whole process unignorable, not just the outputs. Who would like to tell a story next?
Shall I tell a story?
Yes, please, Helen.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. It's not a story, I suppose, but perhaps some comments, and then I've not got a structured response to all 3 questions. Sorry. So it's just, and it might be quite not left field, but adjacent to what your fundamental concern is, but dropping it in as an idea for how to think about this in a different way. So participation is at the root of most of the Young Foundation's work, and on citizen assemblies, you can absolutely see in specific circumstances, on specific need for the state to do something, that the sort of idea, you see it with the abortion bill and the sort of examples that John's given, that there is a role to sort of be, you can see how it sits in the sort of democratic, or should sit in the democratic system. But we don't do citizens' assemblies, but we do something that is a bit similar. We do lots of different work, but particularly the principle that underpins that work is not to do work which says, we have determined this as a collective, and so you must do that. It's more, we have determined this as a collective, and so we will do this. And so instead of having citizens speaking to state, we bring the whole system into the room, where at a local level you'll have the voluntary and community centre, local communities, business and industry, people that provide public services, and you're bringing people into a room to do some collective intelligence in the same way, similar ways in which you bring data and all kinds of plural forms of evidence into the room to determine what you know about something. And then the collective sense making is also done at a collective level. So it's not just citizens, it's all those other actors as well participating in that in a more equitable way. And then crucially, it's about then collective action. So how do all those people with their different levers for change, whether you're sitting in a neighbourhood community group, or sitting in running an airport, or doing any number of things, or sitting in a local government office, how do you bring your different levers for change to bring together to make collective action? And although that is it's not democratic, it's not democracy, it is democratic process, if you like. And so I think just thinking about, we're not just always asking somebody else to do something, that we have some distributed sense of responsibility, that actually if you have very, very big social challenges, there is a very narrow range of quite blunt policy instruments that can make really deep cultural change, and a very narrow set of instruments that can actually unpick some of the entrenched behaviours around health, climate, all of those sorts of things. So I think this is maybe for me just like is this always the answer? And then if we say, well, actually those sort of things have to sort of happen at a local level, then to your point of, how do you make it unignorable? I would say, well, big change tends to happen when lots and lots and lots of very small things not only happen that are underpinned by the same principles, but are collectively visible, where the sort of bottom-up sense of actually this doesn't feel right anymore. And it's the bottom-up thing that pushes the Overton window to say, oh yeah, we can't not do this because more and more people want to do it. So I think that's the way I think about it.
Cool. And I just have one follow-up question for you, Helen, which was with the local process you were describing, the collective intelligence, collective sense making, when it comes to people doing things next off the back of that, the collective action is that everyone comes up with recommendations and everyone's required to follow those recommendations, or is it people then break into their particular types and the businesses come up with what they're going to do, and the whatever council comes up with whatever they're going to do, and they come from the same sense making, but they're only making decisions for themselves?
A bit of both. So some collective action, but often you're saying, well, I as business X can do this, and I know that I can contribute to that wider priority that we've set because I know that there's a theory of change that tracks my action to that. So there's a sense of the collective, and some partnerships emerge through those processes. I wouldn't say that we were like we haven't got 10 years of experience of doing this stuff. It's like a few years, right? So it's not completely proven, but I think it's the idea of just having a much more distributed sense of where responsibility sits for me.
Cool, thank you. And I think Martin then Ken. So Martin.
Yes, thank you. I think I think there's some commonality in regard to what Helen also said and John at the beginning, because if we look at the examples in Taiwan, and if we look at I filmed a citizen council on the refugee crisis in 2015 in Austria. And the thing was that the decision makers, they were in a situation where they needed some outside impulse, because in the refugee situation, if they didn't do anything, they would get attacked. If they did too much, they would get attacked. So they're in this really deep need, and they want some kind of sense of direction from the outside, and then they'll be happy to take it. And I think what happens also in Taiwan, and I think Audrey Tong was crucial here, I think also because of her spiritual background, she has this this natural capacity for systems thinking and working with the system. And I think that's what Helen just described, that you have the system in the room. And with assemblies, we do not involve the policy. We involve policymakers to get information from them, yes, and expertise, but we don't involve them as participants in the process as it would. And if the system is in the room and the whole is in a conversation, the solutions emerge from the system. It's not somebody who decides who has to do something. And I think that's a key distinction. The Citizen Council often does recommendations for the policymakers. And I think that's dangerous. I think it's better to find a way how we can connect the policymakers and choose the topics where there's a real actual need, and not, I think, or we do it, I think that's the big question. How do we create assemblies where we can connect the policymakers as part of the system and not just recipients of the recommendations? And I think that if we could change that a little, I think that would make a huge difference.
And do you have a story from your own work? Was it in Austria that
I think that story in Austria, just like in Ireland, there was this need, and then around the refugee situation, and out of that, the recommendation, they were put into practice by the state government and by the different regional organizations, and it really went quite well. I think it was one of the more successful ones in Austria, just like the one in Ireland. And exactly, yeah.
Great, thank you. And then Ken. Apologies if I'd mispronounced your name there.
It's Khan. It's okay
Oh.
to mispronounce it. Couple of thoughts. One, I very much agree with what Martin says. I think legitimacy does rely on having stakeholders included, and I guess this is my big point: is that inclusion is the way to get a thing not ignored. If it includes all the main stakeholders or a segment of the population, say, for example, Pontypridd, which has just suffered considerable flooding, were to establish its own People's Assembly to discuss how to deal with the flooding. And if that included all the people of Pontypridd, that would be very difficult for politicians to ignore. It would have legitimacy. At the national scale, that would mean many millions of people would need to participate in it. We've just had a petition calling for a new general election, which was supported, I think, by something like 3 million people, some extraordinary number, and has been ignored by the government because it's not regarded as legitimate. So the challenge for us is going to be overcoming that contest of legitimacy with existing institutions. That they will say, we are elected, we are more legitimate than you. Why should you independently set up assembly have the say? You know, we are the existing government, we have been elected. So two suggestions follow from that. One is do it locally where you can get considerable inclusion about something that really matters to the population, say a flood, or the local future of the local hospital, or the future of the local school. It's got to be something that really matters. It's not, you know, why we hate politics or what should we do about the bike pass. It's got to be something that really matters to people. Otherwise, people won't show up. And if that includes all the relevant people, all the locals with a stake, then it will have legitimacy. The other way of doing it might be, I love the Taiwan model, John, that you talked about. I've long been a fan of Audrey's, of setting up an infrastructure to enable mass participation in decision making that waits for that moment of opportunity that you talk about. And I think you mentioned it in the chat there, where something happens that builds the pressure for participation, for the people's voice to be heard. And then you get legitimacy by 5 million people signing up to the existing infrastructure that you've already established, call it Gov0 UK or whatever. That's another possible means. I have a story, but I'll stop there.
Well, actually, I was going to encourage people to tell their stories, because we've had a couple of contributions which have been more starting with the insights. And I'd love to hear your story now, actually, Khan. And then we'll go to Sarah for her story. But right now, Khan, can you tell us your story?
Well, my story is from the ground of one of the only places in the world where this is actually happening, where there's genuine bottom-up self-government from the communal level, the village or the town level, a place called Rojava in northeast Syria, where they're implementing the ideas of a thinker called Murray Bookchin on communalism, who believed in bottom-up government and confederation as the way to take decisions at scale, what the leader of the PKK came to call democratic confederalism. And I've been there, I filmed it, I've written about it, and it's a very inspiring example of what we're talking about. I would add, however, though it doesn't involve randomly selected assemblies, doesn't involve sortition, it involves full participation from the bottom up. That is how it works. Local assemblies make decisions for themselves. Where necessary, these are scaled up to a bigger scale through representatives who are recallable, where the institutions are fully transparent. And if a representative does not represent the decision of the communal assembly, they can be recalled. This is also the principle of sociocracy, interestingly, which is being practiced by another movement. I'm involved in the Children's Parliaments of India, which is this extraordinary, huge movement of mass democracy at the local level across India, now involving adults as well as children. So, you know, my preference in this choice between random or sortition chosen assemblies is very much to go instead for popular assemblies, whatever you want to call them, and the terms are unfortunately interchangeable: citizens' assemblies, people's assemblies, but assemblies where everybody participates and contributes to the decision.
Great, thank you. And before I pass on to Sarah, one thing to note, I think when it came to that petition, which had 3 million signatures, at least 16 of them were Keir Starmer. So it's possible that not all of the 3 million signatures, or it's possible that it wasn't 3 million UK voters who signed that petition. Sarah, you were going to share with us a story.
Yes, just smiling at Boaty McBoatface, which is what happens to every movement in the end. Thank you. Yeah, this conversation is wonderful. A lot of it is like the inside of my head on a daily basis, because these are the issues that we wrestle with. It's the how to get things over the tipping point, how to make things happen. So I've got lots of things I could talk about, but I want to stick with John's original question about how do we create things from outside the system, not getting the existing system to commission them, and you know, try and use that mechanism. And so I suppose I want to talk about the couple of times recently where we've just missed it and where the ball has been dropped, because there are some very close shaves in the very recent past in terms of getting the existing system to change. And I actually don't think we're as far off as maybe it feels we are. And one of them is Sue Gray resigning and being kicked out, and the other is assisted dying. And actually both of those, if the stars had aligned in a very slightly different way, I think we might be seeing legitimate Ireland-style citizens' assemblies commissioned from within the system. Now, then the challenge then becomes, is that enough to get us that kind of systemic change that this needs to be, or would it have kind of then sort of soggily gone back into a sort of deliberative research space? John's nodding. Yeah, I think I'm probably more in that place today than I normally am. But I think the assisted dying piece, I mean, actually, if the bill hadn't gone forward quite as quickly, and we'd had another year, I think there might have been a chance to do some of that building of support and advocacy around the need for public voice in that, because the MPs were very scared about having to make that vote and vote on their conscience, and they didn't have the right information, they didn't feel supported. And had there been time to mobilise the grassroots deliberative democracy infrastructure to help MPs, then there might have been more calls for that in the run-up. And now, as we see, we're mired in a kind of weird procedural thing about the machinery of government, and there won't be space for it. If it gets kicked out, it might then come around again, and there might be time for it again. But the other thing that happened, of course, was that the Nuffield Foundation, with great kind of goodwill, ran their own citizens' jury. So a lot of people now say, well, there's one has happened, so why would we need another one? So that idea of where you slot it into the existing system, I think it's really challenging, and quite often the decision is to not do something, which feels kind of depressing and feels like we're not moving forward, but is often the place we're in. And the other thing to just mention is that, you know, Sue Gray was going to do this, and had she not fallen foul of her party, I think not because of her views on deliberative democracy, it would have sneaked in quite a boring civil servicey way. And it would have been present in a lot of the government decision-making processes in quite a calm sort of manner, I think. And that, you know, that's the sort of real politics of it. You could argue that perhaps there wasn't enough support around it for that to go when the main person went. But that was happening.
Well, the rumor today is that she's going to be nominated to the Lords, so we'll see whether she can use that spot. I think at the beginning, John sort of was saying you had a story around the People's Plan for Nature. For those,
yeah, I mean,
can you just?
I'm not sure if I do have a story around. I'm not sure which story you'd like me to tell, John. I think there's the aim around the People's Plan was to, as you said, leverage that excitement around the BBC's Wild Isles to see whether there would be a kind of blue planet moment for the UK. But again, you see, I think that the system has swallowed it. I think there's been lots of really specifically great things that all the charities have done as a result, but I don't think it's moved institutionally anything in terms of where citizens' assemblies might be in that space. I think there's the final thing I wanted to say is about lots of the really great stories we've heard so far have been around everyday democracy that's distributed, and I think it's really interesting that we're not elevating those enough, because they're kind of they go against that slightly hero narrative that we all want to feel, that we're all coming in and we're saving things by creating a big institutional change from the centre. And actually this slow burn, bringing people in, building deliberative democracy from the ground up may well be a way forward. And I just wanted to kind of highlight that it doesn't feel as good as when you say, oh well, you know, we did this in Ireland, or this happened, and here's the big change, and it was in all the papers. Having said that, I think there is now a window for making that movement to push the government from the outside, because this government is now stuck in self-doubt and confusion, and won't make the big changes it needs to make. So I think it's time for an external movement of all of us and others to make a quite precise push on what needs to change. I'll stop.
Thank you, Sarah. And I have a message from John saying, can you say a brief word about People's Plan for Nature? You can, but only if you tell the story. I feel like I've been saying to people, please tell me the story. So please tell me the story of the People's Plan for Nature. What with a beginning, a middle, and an end? Please.
That's the most dangerous question anyone's ever asked me. I could tell about 50 of these. The one I wanted to tell, though, was about how we tried to, and I think failed to, at a very early stage, create legitimacy from outside the system, because the original idea was to create a convening coalition that had, using some of Khan's language, kind of even greater, like, comparative democratic legitimacy to the existing government and beyond. So the original proposal was to have the three big nature conservation organizations, but also have a major business, and we had a couple in the running, and also have the Church of England, and also have one or two others, like, as the convening coalition. And I think, had we, in the end, the internal politics of nature NGO world, which struck this whole thing several times, frankly, struck it. But the story of the attempt to create a kind of convening coalition as a source of democratic legitimacy, I think is potentially a really interesting one that could be used in other circumstances.
So the story goes, there was an attempt to convene, that there was then some convening, and then there was some citizen participation which came up with the People's Plan for Nature. Is that right?
The story was we had the idea of doing a multi-phase crowdsourcing campaign to crowdsource a People's Plan for Nature that culminated in an assembly that would digest the input from a whole range of other exercises around the country. And the idea was that would seed a massive national conversation that would then be digested and be ready for David Attenborough to launch it on the day of the first episode of Wild Isles. And all of that was promised to us that it would happen and was possible, including doing 4 meetings of the Assembly and having a gap between the third and fourth, so that you could go back out to conversation and consultation, which would build the energy even more. And the first step of that was creating a convening coalition that was going to be cross-sector, and, like, this can be recorded but should not go too far, if that's all right. But was like, and that I think, as an ambition for how you might do this kind of thing, where you actually create anyway, that the internal dynamics kind of got in the way at every step. But I still think there's something to that idea.
Cool. So there's different parts of that which may be interesting. One is having a mixed, or having a convening coalition who may have too much politics to be able to speak to each other and don't send each other Christmas cards. It might be difficult for them to have some kind of joint action. But the notion of using a sort of national water cooler moments as times which can be unignorable, and if you know those in advance, what can you be doing to be ready for them and to have lots of material that can seed that national conversation? Maybe you don't need a wide coalition to be the convener for that, or maybe the wide coalition gets in the way, if that's was John's experience. But nevertheless, the unignorable moment and preparing for it is part of the rich tapestry of that story. Stephen, do you have a story for us?
Yeah, I've had a really stressful evening, just to say, with kids shouting at me. So I've just about recovered my composure. So I'm going to try and do this in story form. Back in 2021, I was doing a research project on the role that arts can play in policymaking. So that's a sort of side interest of mine. I'm an artist and I work in policy. And I interviewed someone, a really close friend, who's a deputy director in the Government Office for Science. And he said to me, it's all about policy lability. Has anyone ever heard of lability? So it's the degree to which atoms in a molecule are stuck together or not. governing the ability of the molecule to change. He was a chemist. The point he was making was that the sort of traditional way of thinking about the ability to influence a policy, and actually he was coming at it from bringing science into policy making, which doesn't always happen, of course. I was thinking about it at bringing some artistic intervention into policy making, but I think it goes for any kind of intervention. It was best to do it at a time when policy was labile, highly labile. So I'm just going to read a couple of bits from a blog I wrote. Ability is a term in chemistry used to describe compounds in which atoms are loosely bound together and so more easily removed or exchanged. One of my interviews from my research suggested that to have a bigger impact, an artwork would need to land at a moment where policy is labile. There are moments when policy is more open or not. If a policy announcement has just been made by a minister and a 2-year delivery plan has been funded and agreed, it may be difficult to influence that policy. If a newer policy issue arises, which has not been the subject of party manifestos and is relatively depoliticized, it is likely to be more labile. And actually, the example that we were talking about at the time was Blue Planet 2, where there was a confluence of things, which including the Chinese approach to waste management, which actually meant that it was a labile space for policy change. Now, I was talking to him about this in the midst of the pandemic, and he sort of quipped, this is the way we used to think about how to influence policy. And actually, in the pandemic, there were so many U-turns. So actually, I think this is almost like a traditional model of thinking about how to influence policy. Think about the timing. If you know there's going to be a big policy decision in 6 to 9 months' time, this feels like a great time. If a big policy decision's just been made, it feels like a bad time. But actually, the nature of the pandemic meant that minds were being changed all the time, and actually people were a bit less worried about that. So I just thought I'd set that out as a sort of framing, which I think is maybe helpful. Maybe thinking about like when that policy is fertile or labile, highly labile, ready to be changed. But I also accept there's potentially an argument. I think this is where a lot of you are in that space, which is almost like, fuck that. And actually, you know, don't worry if the policy is not ready, or don't always be waiting for government to be setting out when the agenda is on, or et cetera, et cetera. We actually need to create that movement to create the conditions where it is there. And I think where I've come to think about this is there's almost like 2 tracks. And one of those tracks is it's the sort of French model, but done properly, right? So the Macron model, but done properly. So i.e. the government sort of sets it up and says, we are ready and we're going to act upon the recommendations, but it's actually done with the ability to deliver on what is promised. And then the other track is actually just doing it completely separately from government. We're not even going to try and get endorsement or agreement that is going to feed into whatever. We're just going to do it and make a big song and dance about it until government then maybe feels that it needs to change. And for me, actually thinking about those 2 tracks is quite helpful. And I think I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you, Stephen. Yes, labile. I've stuck the Wikipedia thing in the chat there. Definition was the word I was looking for. There's also, in terms of systems thinking tools, there's something called the Estuarine framework from the Cynefin folk, which is like, how much energy would this take to change, and how available is it? So there's this sense of, is this the right moment? And I think that's something that joins together a lot of what people have been saying is this the right moment? With that, who has a story? Who's not told a story yet? Who would like to tell a story? And I'm going to be strict on requiring it to be a story. And Stephen, you may need to mute whilst you're typing, by the way. Lachlan, what story would you like to tell us?
Yeah, I can tell a story.
Once upon a time.
Once upon a time, it's the beginning at the beginning. So yeah, it's about personal work, personal project, working on humanity projects with Claire. Towards the start of this year, we supported local organisers to put on a load of these assemblies around the country, 50 in total. And as beautiful as these spaces were, there was very little material impact. And I guess for me, I felt that was, I mean, it's a problem in the sense that there were people bringing their concerns to the assembly about their real conditions, their lived experience. And then if that's not followed up, you know, that's obviously not a good thing for anyone involved. So I guess that there's this kind of sense that, you know, this is a really, really important question to be really honouring the experiences that people are bringing to the assemblies, and so as not to kind of undermine the trust. A few dynamics that I've kind of noticed is that, yeah, you need to set aside substantial resources for after the assembly, after the process has been run. Another dynamic that I've seen is like, if you're running these in series, one after the other, your work is going to multiply, because the more outputs come out, then the more kind of, I guess in our context, it was community projects leading to action. And the effect of that is that it can suck away organizers and volunteers away from the organizing the assembly process. If I can just sneak in just a little extra point, something I'm really interested in, I'd like to just throw into the space, concerns, yeah, why is it that politicians aren't acting on these outputs of the assemblies? And thinking about that more than just, oh, it's because they don't want to give up power, which is what I hear a lot in activist spaces or other kinds of spaces. So, you know, is it a question that they don't understand what, you know, participatory processes do they not, you know, do they not sort of like, do they feel that they already have like a mandate from their constituents? What I really want to like understand what really, really, really are the barriers, whether psychological, sociological, or whatever. So I'd love to hear what other people have to say about that. Thanks for listening.
Great, thank you. And that makes me think in terms of sort of user-centric research, like as in, if we want people to be using the outputs of citizen assemblies, like, do we know what those users want from it? Do we know why they're not used? So that users here being both politicians and policymakers, and both the think tank world and the civil service world. I am going to take a final call for stories before I invite Claire to give us some themes. So I think Tom was first, then Pete, then Sarah. There's like a flurry of hands, which beat my sorry, word for it, my sort of ability to spot exactly who went first. But I think it was Tom, Pete, and then Sarah. So let's go in that order.
Okay,
Tom.
great. Thanks a lot. Cheers. Thanks for having me here. This is so good to be here and hear this discussion, because it's exactly what we at the Sortition Foundation are kind of here to do, is how do we get these things to happen and have power. I'm going to see if my definition of a story meets yours, David. So I've got two kind of anecdotal stories. So my understanding is on the comms issue, right, the French climate discussion had its own internal media unit and was very successful at reaching the public. So we can have a debate about whether the outcomes of that not being implemented properly, is that a success or not. But I think the comms, the independent media approach within that process seemed to have real resonance. There were loads of people in the population who'd heard about the process. There's something there about having, you know, independent, autonomous outreach within a process. So that story stuck with me. Another story that stuck with me, perhaps controversially, just thinking about what I think Lachlan was just saying. I heard Oliver Escobar in a Knocker presentation talking about the Scottish climate process and saying that, I mean, I'm sure that there are many cases where we don't implement the outcomes because it's not in a lot of vested interests. And he was talking about how on the baby slopes a lot of these institutions are, and even when there seemed to be a lot of goodwill and resourcing put into implementing outcomes, it still didn't happen for a lot of reasons that, you know, that seem like joining together a bunch of organizational units that don't usually work together is hard for monolithic organizations. So that's another story. And then another story I want to tell is kind of one that I'm in the middle of, which is maybe not a silver bullet tipping point moment. So it's more humble, kind of, how do we make better ingredients go into this? How do we get more value out of this process? And maybe riffing off what Sarah was saying about, look, we're doing a lot of this stuff already. What can we get out of that that's better than what we're getting now, rather than a kind of aha moment, which is that we're in the middle of restarting a conversation with folks we work with or are in touch with in the sector about how can we get more value out of these processes? How can we make them more robust to attack? So it's, you know, how do we follow up a year after the process and look for how do we build that funding for research into outcomes into our processes? And we're having some of these discussions tomorrow. You know, how do we get open access to the resources that are produced, to the media? How do we share and give a platform to participants to tell those so powerful stories that can really connect with the public about, look, this is the value, this is the legitimacy of this experience because I've had this transformational experience myself as a human being. How do we shore up the standards that the UK sector pulled together so that people can't throw stones at us as easily? Because look, we've got some agreed standards, we are keeping to them. How do we connect with the researchers? I've met a bunch of researchers in the last couple of weeks who are working on understanding what the public think about these processes. So and I'm thinking we could do so much more to be in contact with them. They're excited about doing more research on this. I'm excited about hearing what they've got to say. There's ingredients in there that don't chime with what I as a practitioner would have expected. They don't always match the standards that we've pulled together. Big +1 for joining up the process outcomes with civil society. I don't know how to do that. I know how to make processes happen with spreadsheets. So I'm really glad to be here and hear from you all thinking about these tipping points as well. But I guess my story is that we're in the middle of thinking about how we can do more on this nuts and bolts approach to building more value into the processes and getting more out and being able to communicate that value more easily to the public, even just writing down in a central place, what are these deliberative processes happening in the UK? You know, we can do more to pool and circle our wagons and pool our resources and put into the communal pot better. And I'm excited about that. And I'm excited that this discussion is happening the day before. I'm going to go and talk about that tomorrow. So thank you for letting me be here.
Thank you, Tom. Sounds like we need some kind of citizen participation observatory based in some institution somewhere to create that list. Now, Pete, your hand was up and then your hand is now down. Does that mean I should move on to Sarah, or do you have a story that you'd like to share?
I just took my hand down. It's fine. I can share a story for sure. So this is at a local level. I did and apologies for those of you that have heard this story before. So a good few years ago, about 10 years ago, I was part of a citizens jury that was based in a housing estate, a huge housing estate in Blackburn. And one of the issues that we talked about quite a lot with the group was access to food and access to fresh food and healthy food and food poverty. And at the end of the process was all very nice, lovely, finished. And at the end of the process, Craig came up to me and he goes, he leans forward like this and he goes, Pete, loved the process, great. And I'd worked with Craig, obviously, for 30 hours and I could see a huge but coming. And he goes, but I'm not going to wait for the fucking council. They're not going to do anything, are they? They'll never do anything. What are they going to do? Do you know what we're going to do? We're going to set up a food co-op on this housing estate. And I was like, brilliant, Craig, go for it, go for it. And behind me, listening to this conversation, was the local Healthy Living Centre. And they heard that and they jumped on it and we both supported Craig and a few of the other participants in the jury. And 2 years later, they established a food co-op on that housing estate with 450 families were members, which arguably may have transformed the diet of people on that housing estate. And the interesting thing, I think you'll like this, Tom, during the sortition process, one of the questions we asked folk was, are you engaged in any voluntary work at present? And if they said yes, we excluded them. So the people that took part in it were not people that were already taking action within the housing estate. So I guess why I wanted to bring this example was because I'm really interested in how at a local level, for sure, anyway, we can make these processes less ignorable by using the enthusiasm and the passion of citizens themselves. And so fortunately, in another climate change citizens jury that we ran a couple of years ago, we got some funding to allow us to support the jury members post-process with taking action there. And they then went on to lobby their 2 MPs after the support from Hope for the Future. They ran accountability sessions with our support with the local authority and other local stakeholders. They worked with local artists to produce an art installation in the middle of town, which shines a shadow, producing a message, because the sun always shines in the northwest. So it produces this message that then links to QR codes that then lists all the citizens' recommendations. So I'm really interested in how we can put in place, like Lachlan describes, some kind of framework of support that recognizes that we will always have out of these processes highly motivated and highly knowledgeable citizens that don't want to go away.
Yeah. The throw has to be good enough to catch, as it were. There's like how to support those people who are motivated afterwards is a great point. And that links to various points earlier on about taking responsibility and not pushing that, not requiring or not relying on institutions you can't control to take up your recommendations, but taking responsibility yourself. That's fantastic. I think we've got Lucy and Robbie, and because I think Sarah's put her hand down, and then we'll have Claire for the first cut of theme. So, and if I could encourage Lucy, oh, Lucy's now taken her hand down, but does she still want to speak?
Yeah.
If I could encourage Lucy and Robbie to be to the point, that would be fantastic. So.
Yep. Okay. Well, I'm going to start with a story about an old rundown swimming baths that's very beautiful in a part of town that needs beautiful things and swimming baths. And so it's not directly connected to an assembly. I suppose it's just that thinking about coalitions. Council were going to shut it. Local community basically petitioned, campaigned, did everything they could to stop that happening. They brought on board some, actually, including one of the bigger nature NGOs. They brought on board a bunch of local and national organisations who got interested. And then the council ended up being a very engaged partner. And at this point, we're nearly at the 30 million that we need to refurbish the entire building and repurpose it and turn it into an amazing space that does all sorts of swimming and cultural activities and becomes a town hall for the local area. So I suppose what I'm interested in is that idea of coalitions of the willing, the not yet willing. And I think that's a really helpful way of us thinking about this. And water is a theme for my question. So I was going to say exactly the same thing about Sarah about assisted dying. It's like, even though everybody's saying Parliament was much nicer, it's such a big national issue that would have been perfect for this. And so water is my other question about a national, if we're talking about national issues with policy, water and rivers, very well known, no easy answer. So just that water question. So reflections then on John's question. I want to think about, like, ignorable by whom? Who do we want not to ignore this? Because there are different ways of looking at that. There's national government, and then there's also Pete's example of the people who are part of that process for whom it changes everything. So I guess for me, there's a lot of focus on the process, and the things that I have learned in my recent experience with all of this is the wraparound stuff is just so important. The prep, the before bit, where you are working to engage people in why it matters, it being more than one-off, what they're going to do with the recommendations, the wraparound around the comms bit, the support for what happens after. All of these things are as important as the process itself, and I don't think they're always thought through with the same depth as the actual process itself. And then I think for me, the other thing is understanding impacts, and those impacts are big and small impacts. And there isn't really anywhere for us to do that at the moment. There isn't really a sort of a national sort of way of looking and understanding, because actually the small impacts, they're not small, they're really big, and they're really, so to Pete's example, are really important. So those are my thoughts around coalitions, the before and the after part of the process, and then who do we want not to ignore?
Thank you. That makes me think of our focus in these conversations has been on the moment of the citizen participation, but of course that's one moment or what moments in a much longer process of trying to change something. So thinking about before and after is really important. Robbie, you've been very patiently waiting. Would you like?
Not at all, and I'm very happy to cede if you'd rather move on to
I
theme.
would rather hear one more story, Robbie, and then we'll bring in.
Okay, well, I'll try and be really succinct. I'm going to tell a story about work that we did at the centre where I'm a fellow at Cambridge with the Commonwealth, which was working with what they call the SIDS, the small island developing states, the people who are really at the very end of the geopolitical food chain, but in very many ways at the very front line of the climate crisis. And it was a process which I think set out to answer three questions, which I think about a lot when I think about governance. When you're asking, how's that working for us in any given context? What's the context in which you're asking? How's that working for us? What are your definitions of working? Who do you mean by us? Who has got to define the us? How narrowly do we often define that us about for whom a system is working? And critically, so much of this assembly work is then about the third question, of whom are you asking those first two questions? So how's that working for us? Who do you mean by us in any given context? Who gets to frame that question? And of whom are you asking those first two questions? What this Commonwealth process did, and I'll be brief about the way it was facilitated. So there was a very conscious effort made to create that variety. So there's a cybernetician, somebody mentioned Sinven and things earlier, who thinks deeply about, there's a guy called Ross Ashby, the law of requisite variety, which says that any organism needs a sufficient degree of variety of response to cope with the complexity of challenge in its environment. So how you set about constituting the sense-making capability in a group is absolutely critical. The other thing that I want to, and I think we did that very well. So you had meetings in which there were representatives of young people's forums working with ambassadors. They were in the same group. So a point that Martin had made earlier, and I'm going at real pace here, so forgive me. My favorite definition of strategy is the economist George Shackle. And he describes strategy as the imagined, deemed possible. So how do you hold the space in which you do that? Imagine what could be. How might we allocate resource? What decisions might we make? And how do you hold that space so that if power is in the room already, the senior servant doesn't roll their eyes at a suggestion made by a participant and kill the imagination space before you've even started. So the critical role of facilitation, the critical role of the epistemic conditions, the knowledge conditions, how you're going to set this assembly up to succeed by thinking deeply and deeply intentionally, almost as a moral act, about the way in which you're going to create the conditions for the work to be done. And lastly, therefore, clearly the relationship with power, and therefore the issues about who will be responsible for and accountable for, and they're different things, accountability and responsibility for the delivery of recommendations. So I think the Commonwealth project has led to the creation of some really exciting new financial instruments for investments in these smaller island developing states as a result of a process which set about to answer a large number of those questions. And I'll stop there.
Wonderful. What an invigorating contribution to end our story section and move to Claire to start on her first cut of the themes that she's heard, of which there are many, I'm sure. So Claire, what have you heard from us so far?
Well, thanks, Robbie. It's a bit like, yeah, follow that. But I suppose I'll start where that leaves off, really, which is, you know, there's a lot of stuff that comes up in these sessions where I often think like this is so like echoes things that we think about in terms of movement building and activism and organizing and stuff. So the idea of the imagined deemed possible is, you know, we've done a huge amount of work in various bits of activism that I've been part of, creative activism, and trying to sort of make things seem possible that are obviously ridiculous, but perhaps like the only thing that you could possibly do that would be reasonable in another way. And on climate, that's really true. And we really went into that sort of be realistic, demand the impossible kind of frame for some time. And I feel like, you know, a lot of that get lost in a rationalist, materialist sort of bun fight of boringness, basically, which is very difficult because it's not just people who are trapped in bureaucracies that find that. You even find that in activism, where you sort of hope people have a bit more imagination. I think also the unreasonableness thing goes to this thing about Overton windows come up today a lot, and the legitimacy word has come up a lot. And I'm wondering whether there seems like there's some sort of an intellectual trap where you either build legitimacy and then you're the sensible people, or you're the very inclusive people, which probably means you herd into somewhere more in the middle, perhaps, versus Overton window shifting, which requires you to just be really, really forthright and really sure about what you want to open up as a possibility at one end of the sort of spectrum somehow. I'm interested in some of these things. I think people do trap themselves in intellectual ways, which is like unacceptable in the current situation. Relatedly to that is the thoughts that I had about story. So whilst people were talking about, I think it was Sarah who said about people being able to sort of introduce things in a calm way in the sort of in the midst of government. And I think this is often sort of, you know, the messiness and the fear around people who are making a big noise and being really stubborn, let's be polite about them, about the thing that they think people need to think about or pay attention to or shift, feels to me like the notion of what's seen as reasonable or sensible that sometimes seems to carry quite a lot of weight in these conversations because they're all about system and they're not about people, then loses the essence of what makes a good story. And I think it's quite hard to make a good story. We've talked about it loads in loads of different rooms that I sit in, because most good stories have got like real tension and passion and jeopardy and drama. And, you know, I don't think about that when I think about very sensible processes. So how can we think about those things, I think is interesting. And there's something very fun and light about the way that somebody like David Graeber talks about the loving sort of potential in bureaucracy, but process rules, how people can actually love them, but they just must not be boring and oppressive, especially not both of those things. So there's something interesting about this. Definitely drama is such an important sort of ingredient in good activism, actually. It doesn't need to be dangerous, but it is important. And then I suppose the other thing, I love what you said, Pete, about excluding people that already do shit. So you get actually fresh people in your assembly by sortition who aren't already busy doing stuff in terms of volunteering or something. If you want self-organized outcomes, that's quite smart. And I suppose the thing about people being ready is like, are people ready? And when we talk about systems as if they're not made of people, which they all are, then is that quite problematic when we think we only look at a systemic solution? And actually every single person in those systems that we're struggling to get to do the thing we want them to do is actually just full of like a shitload of people. So rather than thinking that it's a systemic problem in terms of our system we want to design or the solution we come up with, is it actually a problem with all the fucking people in the world? And is it a problem with all of us as well as them? I don't know. That feels like it's quite an opening up of something. And in the power conversation, what I've written down here is, if it's about timing and potential, and you see a moment and you move on it and you go, fuck, that thing's happening, let's do something. And then you have a really long process that takes months to organize. That's not how politics works. And I always find it interesting how much I think politics quite like fashion, which is my background. And so it's a timing thing. Like there is a time when you wear that shade of coral and there is a time when you do not wear that shade of coral. And everyone kind of knows it in their bones. They know it's that time when you're like, oh, I want to wear pleats. Fucking, oh, everyone wants to wear pleats. So I do think there is something about this like timing thing that is quite, you sort of remove the intuitiveness when you run a process that takes 16 months, right? Or whatever. It strikes me that these things take ages to do, but also they take ages to fundraise for and plan and coalitions and blah, blah, blah. It's really quite long. So that's interesting. However, what I've written down is when X, we do Y. I do feel like sometimes we could be thinking about things in a way where we're sort of preparing for a thing to happen. And if you can see the inevitability of something falling apart, which I would say is our circumstances today, then you could be thinking about smart things that you will do when a disruption hits the system that's much bigger than what anyone can do by just being organized and annoying, which is now almost too illegal to do anyway. But if you expect major disruption to the systems that you're trying to change, then you've got no excuse to not be ready for those. And I don't know anyone who's making a sort of scenario plan for what happens if shit really hits the fan. And I wrote down when X, we do Y, because actually you could also almost sort of, at the start of a process, I was wondering, you could almost sort of say, well, if this process comes out and says we want these things to happen, and you have X amount of time to respond, then you could organise non-payment campaigns that are, you know, you press the button on them 6 months after the results or 3 months after the results. And unless they've entered in, the power holders have entered into a serious negotiation about genuinely enacting some of the things you want, you could do that routine, which is quite effective on small institutions with direct action. If you write to them and say, we're going to do this, and then go on hunger strike unless you meet us and agree to do your thing, you usually do have to do the hunger strike. But we found on a series of universities and different institutions similar size that there's a formula that basically works. You say you need to divest, we're going to paint your building and get nicked and you'll be embarrassed, and then we'll go on hunger strike. And when you've been on hunger strike for about 2 weeks or less, you usually get a negotiation from the people at the university because they shit themselves and they think you might die. And all they've got to do is divest. So then they actually call emergency meetings and do it. So there are recipes, I think, we could think about our experience from the movements about how to tie some of these things together.
Claire, we can tell it's been a generous session for you because your themes kept on going there.
Sorry.
I think what would be great, Claire, is if you could type into the chat like your headlines of those themes. And I guess we probably don't have time for everyone to respond to those. But I think if there's something you felt was really important, but you didn't hear in what Claire had to say, now is the moment to stick that in the chat and just go, here's something I've heard across what a couple of different people have said here. And for as much as Claire had lots of different thoughts, that actually didn't come up in those. We want to make sure those go down there because Alex will be pulling this all together into Alex will be pulling this all into a brief output for us, and we'll be using it more widely with the conjunction with the other roundtable. So now is your moment to help to steer what Alex writes by going, this is a theme I heard, and just sticking it in the chat. Robbie, rather, you have put your hand up, sir.
Just very, very quickly then, because I know we're running out of time. A couple of things in response to John's initial provocation. I think one of the themes I'm hearing is, I know it's a very old one, but is the principle of subsidiarity. At what level of complexity are you trying to make decisions? So one of the things that John was talking about is a way of thinking about one very big thing and lots of propagation. So when one thinks about scale and propagation, we very often think of one big thing that needs to be very, very scaled and lots of small things that can create a context in which things are shifting. So being clear about, if you like, what level of complexity are we seeking to work in any given context around the purpose of that decision making, the purpose of that gathering together. And then one last quick thought about storytelling, which is the hero's journey, which it always strikes me that somebody being invited into a citizens' assembly leaves their ordinary world, enters the process full of its trials and its tribulations and its hugs and its tears and its walkouts and its excitements and its mentors and its shapeshifters and things. And then hopefully you go and you grasp the elixir and you bring something really meaningful back into the world. So in storytelling, that process has got a very, very fabulous traditional storytelling lens. So there's two thoughts: subsidiarity and complexity, propagation and scale, and hero's journey. It's actually three. So I'll stop that without becoming Monty Python. The fourth thing, I will stop there.
You will not have a fourth thing, Robbie, because I'll stop you from speaking because we're nearly at the end of our time together. Josh, I'm not sure if you saw the chat, but do you have a picture you were able to share with us if we were to ask you to?
Yes, let me see if I can get it to work.
Well, just before you share, and I think there we are. So you've got it there on your screen, and as we reach our end, if you want, you can pin Josh's whatever it is, their video to, and that will make it big enough for you to be able to see. Because at the moment, at least on my screen, it's one of 16 squares, so it's a little bit tiny. I want to say a huge thank you for all of your contributions and generating so many thoughts in so many people. Claire and John, Alexander, do you have any closing thoughts? John, you haven't had a chance to speak for a while, so you can go next on anything you'd like to say by way of closing, Mr. Alexander.
I mean, I think I'm really interested in how we create the space for politics to move into, and I think that resolves a lot of the idea that there's a tension between Overton window and legitimacy because you're out ahead of the game. And I think the key question then becomes how do you create a space that's sufficiently radical in the definition of the space? I'm really interested in the idea of a crowdsourcing a people's charter and what Ollie Whittington and the gang are doing with the Our House campaign, and it's a shame that they're not in the room. And I think that can be built from the local. Anyone who knows my work knows that it begins with telling the stories of what people are already doing, not beginning from the local in a kind of negative way, but beginning with the best at what's going on. But there's too much to try and make a coherent thing. So I'm going to shut up.
Great, thank you. And Claire, what would you like to say by way of closing?
Thanks very much. I got quite excited at the end.
Well, thank you very much to everybody. Alex will be sharing, well, hopefully if Josh shares his picture with Alex can share it with all of you in the coming days. We also have a summary wrap-up roundtable next week, which Alex can send you a link to. I think that will be mostly the people who've been the creatives presenting back what's occurred to them, whether it's things like Josh has made there, or poems or songs or what have you. And there'll be many more things coming out over the next few months from the Humanity Project and from Hard Art building all of this great work. And there was an idea of scenarios, Claire. There's a project for somebody to come up with different scenarios, therefore to spot what things to be ready for and what things to build governance institutions in advance of. And I was also thinking that I've never had a desire to wear pleats, so maybe I'm going in the wrong circles in terms of those fashion choices. And with that, thank you very much, everybody. And I release you at 1 minute later than I said I would, so apologies.
Thanks, David. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Cheers, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thanks,
Cheers,
Alex.
everyone. Good night.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
So glad Boaty McBoatface got on the drawing, Josh.
Always. It's never far away from my thoughts. I think I speak for all of us when I say truly represents, the level we're at.
Oh, I see. There's a boat. It's amazing. What did they call it in the end? Didn't they call it the David Attenborough? Well,
I think they quietly changed the name after the fact.
Yeah.
But that's
because they don't. That's because they don't like democracy, Josh. That's what.
Yeah, exactly.
People wanted.
The story's still out there. That's what everybody knows. No one knows the David Attenborough boat. Everybody knows the boat-faced boat. There's a lot of boats in there.
Josh, can you click on the 3 dots and make me host again?
3 dots in
the corner of your window, your speaker window.
Ah, yes, yeah, 3 dots.
Yeah, and sorry, in the corner of mine, and make me host.
Ah, yeah, okay. Make host. There we go.
Cool.
You got it?
Yep, got it.
Yeah, cool. Okay, I'll